Okay, that's probably it's probably something along those lines, but it was just so much larger than all of the other ones in the area. I just couldn't stop looking at it. And so at this point, I kind of swiveled around on the rock I was sitting at and leaned in and was really staring at it. And it was facing away from me, almost like it was drinking out of the creek, but I couldn't see what its head was doing. But it was just right up on the edge of the water. And it sounds kind of silly to say, but I was staring at it and I just spoke directly to it. And I said, I've never seen a butterfly like you before.
Yes, and many children see them too. About 75% of the world's children today are being born with etheric vision. And when your children talk with people and have daydream playmates, the chances are they are actually speaking to some of these people. Because these angels or angelic forces or nature spirits, as they're often called, will often make themselves seen.
Whatever it is, it looks every bit like a fairy and very little like anything else.
But seriously, it kind of looks like a fairy. It just kind of doesn't look like your standard moth.
I know that the paranormal is real. Listen.
But I wasn't going to make this video until I looked a little bit closer and I realized after it lands behind my bench, it disappears. And it just vanishes. And in fact, I went outside to look, to try to find it, to see if it was trash, to see if it was a bug, to see if it was a leaf, like trying to figure out what it could be, and it was gone. It just vanished.
What's that? Yeah. What's what? Yeah, look. Right up there. Insect or something.
Is that an insect? Let's have a look. What is it?
I don't know. Oh my god!
Oh.
What happens to people who cut down fairy films?
Did you see it? Huh? Did you see it?
Yeah, me and him saw it.
What'd you see?
It was like a big creature.
A big creature?
Yeah, like around 10 feet tall.
I'm not going to BS you guys. One of my partners said they saw something fall out of the sky too, so that's why I'm kind of curious. Did you see anything land in your backyard?
The paranormal is real. Is it? The paranormal is real.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the Fascinating Fae podcast. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have a guest who has a deep experience in the woods on a variety of levels. We're going to be speaking tonight with William. William is coming to us today from California. Is that right, William?
Montana.
Oh, I apologize. Montana. William's got a background in wildlife ecology. He's done some study as a paleontologist, working with the U.S. Forest Service. And something that I would like everybody listening to know about William is that he is a forest firefighter. And William, just before we get started, I do want to thank you for that work. It's incredibly dangerous and difficult work. And we all cherish our forests. People who are appreciative of fairies tend to be also very appreciative of nature. And so just on behalf of everybody listening, I would like to thank you for that work that you do, putting yourself at risk to fight fires in the forest for us.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
I sincerely mean that. Not everybody has a job that potentially will put them in that kind of risk. And so it is admirable that you do that, and I do appreciate that you are taking the time to come on here, because in part you have let me know that your story is related to that work, which is another reason I wanted to let people know about that background. So basically, as we move forward here in this conversation, William, now that you've been introduced, I would just like to ask if you would be so kind as to, for myself and for the audience, if you would be so kind to just walk us in to your encounter with the fairy that you experienced. What I mean by that is, if you could just tell us when this happened, like what year, what time of year as well, what you were doing, that kind of stuff, what was happening that day, as much as you feel is necessary for this to make sense and to have some context for the audience. And then just walk us into your encounter and let us know what happened, please.
Yeah, of course. So this encounter happened to me in midsummer of 2021. I believe it was around the 4th of July holiday. I didn't write this down, journal it, or anything, so that's my best guess. But in my memory, looking back on the day, that seems to be right, just based off the weather and kind of the general atmosphere of the crew. 4th of July is always kind of an exciting time of year in the Forest Service, because things are well underway, everyone's making money, the weather is still pleasant. And the day that this encounter happened started off fairly similar to most days working for the Forest Service. It is a very exciting job, but mostly it is very mundane, can be very long stretches of boredom, punctuated by high intensity. And this day, we had woken up, had done our morning PT exercises, gotten the engines ready. This was my third summer working as a wildland firefighter. And so myself and the crew, we were all, well into the swing of things, had a good routine going. And I remember specifically that it was just a absolutely gorgeous day out. Height of summer, not a cloud in the sky, and peak summer in Montana is just like it's a very special place to be. It's a very, for lack of a better phrase, just a magical environment. And I don't want to get too specific about location, just for my personal privacy, but also the privacy of the group that I was attached to at this point in time. But to say this is a very isolated location, very far from any city or large town, especially by coastal standards. And on this morning, after we had prepped the engines, worked out, the crew that I was working with was attached to a Type 6 initial attack engine. Basically, what that means is that, let's say you're out in the forest and you see smoke, or someone in one of the lookout towers sees a column building in the woods. Initial attack is most of the time they're Ford F-550 truck with a pump system built on the back. And typically you can fit 4, if you had to, 5 firefighters inside one of these trucks. And so our job was to get there as quickly as possible to try to tackle a fire while it's still a small, manageable size, before you would have to get in something like a hotshot crew or a repeller crew, something that is a more something that's a little bit more of a complicated resource to deploy and organize logistically, a more expensive resource. So we're a very mobile unit, and our job is basically be ready at any given time to try and catch a fire while it's about an acre, let's say, and try and get that stomped out before it becomes 10, 20, 50, 100 acres over the course of an afternoon. Something that I think is important that people don't realize initially is how quickly fires spread. And it's one thing to watch some wood burn in your fire pit. It kind of can be kind of frustrating trying to get a fire built recreationally, but when it is on the landscape, especially a landscape like Montana in the summer, very dry, fires can do a lot of damage very quickly and grow out of control very fast. So when we get calls like we did on the morning of this encounter, everyone is very excited, amped up, high energy, because we know that once we arrive, it's going to be go, 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 go until we've got this thing licked. There's really not a lot of downtime when you're actively fighting fire, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong, that can go from you getting something contained quickly to spilling over and it becoming a big problem. So it's the mindset going into this encounter, I believe, is kind of important, because you are on a very high alert. It's not like a daydreamy kind of environment. You're very focused on the task that you're doing. So we got called out to a chunk of private property. A person was using an angle grinder in a negligent way, I would say, and throwing sparks into the tall grass. And he set his pasture on fire. And we had the local, we would call them the militia. They are a group of ranchers who have firefighting equipment that they build onto the back of their trucks or have in their possession, and that they're a great resource because they'll come and help each other out as a separate unit to the Forest Service coming out as well. So when we arrived, there was a few people from the local militia there, and to lay out the landscape a little bit, we were doing most of the active suppression in a tall grass field. It wasn't an agricultural space necessarily. It wasn't like a hay field or alfalfa or anything like that. This was grazing grass for the man's horses and cattle, but tall grass, about 2-3 feet high. And this fire was spreading through there very rapidly. And that was off on the right-hand side of the ignition point. And to the left, there was a thin, very, very beautiful creek, very clear, the kind of creek that, like, you look at it and you just want to jump in, you know? And fairly shallow, and I would say probably about 8 feet across. So not a river by any means, but enough water to supply the needs of this ranch. And it was a very pristine source of water as well. So that was off to the left-hand flank of this fire. And so we tied in to the parking lot area and did what we call a pump and roll, which is basically, for this particular scenario, I was driving the truck and we had one of my crew members outside with the hose. I'm driving at about just a step down from a jogging pace. And as I'm driving, they are spraying the fire down. And this is something that we had gotten pretty good at. I mean, very, very standard firefighting procedure. And we were able to keep this flame from spreading too far uphill into a chunk of Forest Service land. It was on private property, but we were able to keep it from getting into the timberline, keep it a grass fire. And we were doing this active suppression for, I'd say, probably about an hour of intense, spray this fire down. Our truck would hold 300 gallons. So dump 300 gallons, go down to the creek, fill it back up, dump 300 gallons. We did that probably 2 or 3 times, just making sure that we had extinguished the flame that was in this grass. So, like I was saying earlier, a very busy, focused mindset going into fighting fire. But the flip side of that is once you have stopped it from spreading, we'll call it contained. But there's a big difference between a fire being contained and a fire being out. Because little packets of heat, embers, ash, can get blown by the wind, and it doesn't take very much heat to get another flame going. So you have to be very careful and monitor the area that you're working in to make sure that this fire is actually dead, out, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. And that process can take a couple of days. So we were tied into that chunk of land very actively for about a week. And this encounter happened about 2 or 3 days after our initial response going out there actively fighting the fire. So on this day, I was operating what's called a Mark III. It is a pump that we'll use to tie into usually natural bodies of water. It is wildland firefighting, so we don't typically do suppression in areas that have access to like a hydrant or something like that. So we'll carry these pumps around with us so that we can take advantage of natural bodies of water. And so on this day, I was running as the pump operator, and I had set up the pump next to kind of call it like a swimming hole, I guess. It was just like a deeper section of this creek, kind of nestled in these cottonwoods. And this, again, was like height of the summer, just clear, beautiful, stereotypical summer day. And everyone else on the crew was out patrolling, looking for hot spots, or doing chainsaw work, taking down damaged trees, splitting logs up so that the heat within them can be dispersed out, drug out into what we call the black, which is just an area that's been burned already. So I was alone when this happened, and I was sitting down by the creek. I'm gonna go kind of slow just to make sure I get the details right here as I'm remembering it. The pump is fairly loud. It's something that if you're gonna be monitoring it. You want to be close enough that you can refuel it. If anything is going wrong with the pumping system, you want to be able to jump on it within a couple of seconds and try and figure it out. So it's pretty loud. It can be kind of uncomfortable to be stationed next to one for long periods of time, but they're very loud. So if something is going wrong with it, you can hear it from a pretty good distance away. So I was wandering up and down the side of this creek, or the bank of this creek, and I just remember thinking to myself a lot, I'm in my uniform and my hard hat and my firefighting gear, so very hot, and just thinking how much I would like to jump into this body of water. There was just something about it that day that was just like, the only word I can think to use is like enticing. And I came back to refuel the pump, and I'd gotten the clear to shut it down for the afternoon. There wasn't need for it to be running for the next couple of hours. So I shut the pump down, and I was sitting on a larger sized rock, staring out into the black with my back facing the creek. And as things got quiet again, with the humming of that pump extinguished, the wildlife started to kind of creep back into the area, I guess. It started to, the songbirds started to sing again, or at least I could finally hear them. But it kind of seemed like the pump had kind of spooked things away, and as soon as it got quiet, the animals started making noise again. And there is a species of butterfly out here that is orange and black, and not the monarch butterfly, but I see them all over Montana, and they are relatively small. I would say maybe typically like an inch tipped tail, and a very dull orange and black color. And they were all over the place in this field and on the side of this creek. And so I was watching a few of these butterflies fly around, and they weren't doing anything noteworthy or interesting, but I just noticed that there was an abundance of them in the area. And I looked over my left shoulder at one point, and I was sitting maybe 3 feet away from the edge of the creek. And I can't tell you why I felt compelled to look, or if anything compelled me to look, but I looked over my left shoulder and I saw one of these orange and black butterflies sitting right at the edge of the creek. But this one was at least twice the size of all of the other ones that I had seen. And so it was just immediately very striking. And I stared at it for a second and looked away, and then stared at it again. And there was just something about this one that I just immediately found interesting. And I was kind of running it through my head and chalked it up to, oh, maybe it's I don't know, could it be an age thing? Is this one just older than the other ones around and thus larger? But knowing what I know about butterflies and how they develop, that didn't really make any sense. I was like, okay, that's probably not it. And I was like, maybe it's sexual dimorphism. Maybe the females are larger than the males, or the males are larger than the females. But I, again, didn't know, so I was like, okay, that's probably it. It's probably something along those lines. But it was just so much larger than all of the other ones in the area. I just couldn't stop looking at it. And so at this point, I kind of swiveled around on the rock I was sitting at and leaned in and was really staring at it. And it was facing away from me, almost like it was drinking out of the creek, but I couldn't see what its head was doing. But it was just right up on the edge of the water. And it sounds kind of silly to say, but I was staring at it and I just spoke directly to it. And I said, I've never seen a butterfly like you before. And as soon as I said that, there was not a delay in me saying this and what happened next. As soon as I spoke to it, and I said, I've never seen a butterfly like you before, it turns around and makes eye contact with me. And then it stands upright. And not like, butterflies have multiple legs, not like it was supporting itself on its back 2 legs, but it kind of pushed all of its legs down. And it's kind of hard to describe. It was like it still had all of its legs on the ground, but it tilted its body into a position that I've never seen a butterfly do in my life. And I just want to make this very clear. There was nothing humanoid about its shape. It didn't have a humanoid face or arms or legs. It was a butterfly, physically. There was nothing special about it other than the fact that it was at least twice the size of all of the other ones of that same species. And now it was in this upright posture, making eye contact with me. And we stared at each other for a second or two. It wasn't very long. And it took off from that upright posture, which I also felt was kind of odd. Usually when you see a butterfly taking off from the flat ground, they'll have their body horizontal to the ground and flutter. But this one was in that vertical posture when it took off. And so I'm now facing the creek, and it was to my right at this point, maybe 3, maybe 4 feet away from me, fairly close. And it flew in a semicircle around me. Farthest away it got, I would say, would probably be about 10, maybe 12 feet. Not very far, and clear enough that, I had eye contact on it the entire time. And I turned and followed it as it flew in this semicircle around me, and never lost sight of it, was focused on it. And now it's at my left-hand side, back on the bank of the creek. And I'm staring at it, and it flies out over the creek. And right at that midpoint, it was like right dead center of the creek. I never took my eyes off this thing for a second. As soon as it hit the middle of the creek, it vanished. And that really, not in a scared way, but it just gave me goosebumps, because now it was something slightly memorable, I guess. Not something that a story I would ever share. I would have forgotten it by now. But I watched this thing simply vanish. And at first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, something. So I stood up and walked to the edge of the creek, about the distance that it was where it had started its crossing, and just stared into the woods on the other side and just searched and searched and searched for this thing. It wasn't flying fast, and butterflies are not known for their ability to fly super fast, and they're also not known for their ability to blend in. This thing was very brightly colored, had a very distinct pattern on it, and a very distinct size compared to everything else that was flying around in the area. And I searched for it for several minutes before I, came to the conclusion that like I wasn't just seeing things. This thing, I watched it disappear, and it just took my brain a second to like rationalize that I did see this thing go from clearly in my view to gone and nowhere on the horizon. And so after that, we were there a couple more days, didn't see it again or have any other things of note from that location. But when I went home that night, or went back to our district, or our station, and got back to the bunkhouse there, I told my oldest sister about it, who was very interested in the paranormal. We have a very understanding relationship with each other, in the sense that she's the person that, oh, you see something weird happen, I can talk to her about it and know that she's not going to give me a joking response or not take me seriously. So I just recounted the story to her just to kind of get her input on it. And I had never really given fairies conceptually much thought. But the thing that she said to me that was very striking was that from her knowledge of the her knowledge of fairy lore, is that they have a very strong association with natural bodies of water. And she said something that I found really striking, which was that in a lot of folklore, fairies are associated with creeks and rivers, and will use these places kind of like a portal. Like, there's something there in regards to these things come in and out of, whether you call it our plane of existence or our ability to perceive them. But when they take a jump from here to wherever they go, the location that comes up a lot is creeks and rivers and natural bodies of water. And the other thing she said that kind of spooked me a little bit, she said this in kind of a joking way, and I want to reiterate that this wasn't something that scared me at all. It wasn't something that left me feeling uneasy or threatened, but just the idea of being lured somewhere. That's another strong connotation in older fairy stories, is they're tricksters, and they'll lure you places. And I was just thinking about how before I had this encounter, how I had this just like borderline uncontrollable desire to just like jump in that creek, and it's just like, oh, no one will know, no one's gonna care if I go for a swim. Obviously they would care if I stopped manning the pump to go splash around in the water. But I thought that was a funny side note to the encounter was this thing, whatever I saw didn't make sense from from a standard view of the world and like from a known scientific perspective, right? This thing vanishing in thin air.
Thank you so much for the incredible detail, the incredible pace at which you delivered that. And I would just like to say right off the bat, what you just described and all the thoughts that you shared along with what you just described are tying together many, and I do mean many, of the eyewitness testimonies that I've had so far, as well as the conceptual unpacking of those encounters that myself and the guests have been attempting to do. And so I want to just right off the bat, first of all, tell you that I absolutely want to affirm that that is a real fairy encounter. It has all of the hallmarks of a real fairy encounter, not the least of which is the disappearing entity right before your eyes. And we'll get to that. I'm going to ask you a few clarifying questions about how it disappeared. Additionally is the sense that this thing heard you speak, and furthermore, the eye contact aspect. Also, the emotional component, which you are doing your best to suppress rationally, I can detect, because you want to be taken seriously here. I can also detect that emotionally confused, like, what did I see? And the goosebumpy, tingly feeling at witnessing something supernatural occurring in front of your very eyes. All of this is remarkable to me and starts to fit what is an emerging pattern in my overview perspective here of what is going on. So I just want to thank you, first of all, again, for taking the time to put yourself, near loud pumps and wearing hot gear on hot days and all of the above to keep the wilderness environment safe from fire. It is truly an admirable profession. And I do wish people listening, did more for firefighters, especially wildland firefighters like yourself. So thank you again for that aspect of your story and giving the audience such a clear perspective on why you were there and what was going on. William, would it be okay with you if I asked you some questions about what you have just told me about, please?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I think I'll just sort of work through my questions in a linear fashion to help with the understanding of what you've described for myself and for the audience. And I just ask out of genuine curiosity. I'd just like to remind you and everyone listening, this podcast is here to collect real stories of people that have encountered fairies, which are a real species of non-taxonomically classified earth-bound species. They're just part of Earth, like mammals and flora and fauna. This is my perspective. And so we're not here to convince anyone of anything. We're here to just tell our stories. And that's really important, I think, for you to be reminded of. And you've done such a fantastic job. I'm truly fascinated, for lack of a better word, and that is the name of the podcast, by what you have just told me. So, William, not many people are going to be familiar with the size of these butterflies. If you could tell people what one of them is in terms of its normal size, and then what the one you saw was. So just try to find an object in your mind that is the same size as a normal one, and then try to find an object that's the same size as the larger one for helping the audience understand, please.
Yeah, of course. So I guess there's two ways that you could look at it. With the wings folded up in a resting position and then the wings spread out in a flight or pre-flight position. So for this reference, I'm going to be using the wings folded out. So that measurement would be from wingtip to wingtip. The typical size that I think would be common to see here in Montana, wingtip to wingtip, would probably be about 1.5 inches. I'm looking at my thumb right now, bent looking at like fingertip to knuckle. And so I would say the typical size would be about 1.5 that distance. So probably about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. Whereas the strange butterfly I saw was I want to say at least twice that size, because it was so much larger that it was immediately striking. So not just a little bit, it was at least twice that size. So I would say a good probably 3 to 3.5 inch wingspan.
Understood. Thanks for that distinction. So that is considerably bigger. And I can understand why, as a person who's familiar with the wilderness environment, you would be very captivated when you saw this thing. Something I forgot to say, which I do want to add here, is if I were to describe my experience to the audience listening, which I have done elements of in this show, I would sound a very similar way to you. I try to preface my encounter with as much contextual value to the day so that people understand this happened at an otherwise normal time. I wasn't doing drugs or meditating or something like that. This happened like for real to me and another person. And so I just have a lot of empathy for people that are trying to describe difficult to explain phenomena. And again, I think you've done like one of the better jobs so far of people that I've had on. And that's for a combination of reasons. I think your personality and your background and experience in the woods all factors into your ability to tell this story clearly. So I just want to appreciate that about you. Now, this thing is quite a bit larger, so that's established. And so I can understand why you're now turning around fully to look at this thing. Can you just clarify for me, when you do fully turn around and look at it, just prior to speaking out loud to it, about how far apart are you and this insect at that juncture?
I would say, so I was about 3 feet from the water's edge. It was right on the water's edge, but with my back facing the water, off to my left-hand side. So I would say probably about somewhere between 4 and 5 feet away.
Okay, so I mean, we're in the range of you could reach out and touch it just about.
Yeah, like I feel like if I had wanted to, if I was a little kid and wanted to grab it up impulsively, I could have caught it.
So this is very close. So now you're looking at this thing intently, as you have described. And I believe that the phrase you told me that you said to it was, "I've never seen a butterfly like you before." Is that correct?
Yes. And that's just stuck in my head because it was just such an odd thing to say.
It's interesting how I don't want to call it our subconscious selves. I think about it more like our higher selves. It's interesting how our higher selves kicks in moments of intensity and does the most surprising things.
Mm.
And this ranges from you deciding to speak out loud to an insect, which is not rational, let's be honest, but is something that your higher self is compelling you to do. Like some part of you, both, it sounds to me like, was able to sense its presence, which you initially described. You didn't know why you needed to look over there, but you did. Some part of you, it seems, was able to sense its presence as and I struggle with this word because I am not a fairy guy, but as a magical protector of that creek, it sounds like. And furthermore, some part of your higher self was instructing you to speak out loud to it. And these things are also hallmarks of fairy experiences, William, is not that you're behaving unlike yourself, but that there's a quality to being around something that is paranormal, magical, quantum physics-y, whatever you want to call it. There's something around being in contact with the other plane that also produces these types of perceivable things that you can reflect on about how you behaved and what you did. And I'll just leave it at that. So now you're looking right at this thing, and this is an incredible position to be in with a fairy, is having such a clear look at it. And so you speak to it, which I think is maybe not logical, as I said, or rational, but I do think that I want to make sure that you understand me. To the listener, right, to the objective critical listener, oh, right, you're going to talk out loud to a bug. But it is rational from the perspective that I just elaborated on. So now you're speaking to this insect, and this is the part where I think I got the most chills when you were talking, and I want to unpack this a little bit if I could, please. You speak to it, and it immediately turns and looks at you. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it was, I mean, the same kind of reaction that you would expect out of like walking up behind someone and calling their name out. It was that immediate, like, little bit of a jump and then quickly turn around.
I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I'm trying to understand. Basically, this thing heard you and reacted like a person would, and like you could see that it had heard you and it turned to look at you afterwards. Is that what you were trying to describe to me and the audience?
Yes. And again, it sounds funny because it is talking to a butterfly, but I think I could have shrugged it off as coincidence if it wasn't there was like this sense of acknowledgement, because it turned around and just locked onto me, and we were staring at each other.
This is fascinating. Now, for the audience who might not have had a chance to be up close to a butterfly, which, many listeners live in cities and may not have that frame of reference, can you describe the eyes, and can you describe any type of... you mentioned earlier, and I want to be really clear, that this is a butterfly. It doesn't look anything strange. It looks like a larger version of the other butterflies. But what do butterfly eyes look like? Where are they on the head? Can you just sort of describe how, when it turned to look, that took place, using a little bit of detail around that aspect, please?
Yeah, so they have somewhat forward-facing eyes, not like you would see on a predator, like a human or a dog. But I could clearly look straight at its face and see both of its eyes, which were, I think the best way to describe it, a lot of insects, their eyes look like a black golf ball. If you can picture like the texture of a golf ball, they have that kind of prismatic shape to them. That dome built of tiny lenses. But they're black, and I was looking directly into both of them. And yeah, they're somewhat forward on the head, and rather large and bulbous. Two black domes that are made up of smaller prismatic lenses.
Thank you for that clarification. I want to just sort of build upon what you're saying with a little bit of thoughts. I have lived in the woods extensively. So I'm 44, and going back about 20 years, I used to be involved with anti-old growth logging protests. And I lived in the woods in protest camps in the deep, sort of old growth bush with 1,000-year-old trees here on the west coast of Canada. And then I just got used to that, and I really started to love it. And so for most of my life, I've either lived on boats or in little tiny cabins in the woods, or just straight up in the woods under tarp structures, basically. And so I know that insects don't really look at you. They're not known for looking at you, really. Most insects, have eyes on either side of their head, like a grasshopper, and so there's no real sense that they look at you. And even a butterfly or a dragonfly, you might get some sense that they're perceiving your presence because they avoid you as they're flying by, that type of thing. But they're not known for turning and looking at you. And so I want to just say, for the audience, really just sort of seize on this particular part of this story as an incredibly standout detail. The chances of mistaking a random set of motions that this bug made for William as it looking at him is extremely unlikely. Just for some further context on this point, I feed these little black-capped chickadees at my condo, and every morning they chirp in the tree, and I open the door and they land on my hands or they land on my head, and they eat. They're so great. They eat peanuts out of my hand. I have a joke where I say, "Which one of you is the fairy?" Because there's one really bold one that is the one that lands on my head, and it seems like it's the lead chickadee. But anyway, I digress. Even the chickadees are looking at me. I can see them from the tree limb looking at the peanuts in my hand, and they cock their head back and forth so that either one of their eyes gets a frame of reference to it, right? And you can see, okay, that bird is looking at my hand, it's looking at the peanuts, it's sometimes looking at me. When it lands, before they take off, they look up at me and they chirp a thank you, and they definitely are looking at me. So you know what it's like when something's looking at you, whether it's a little bird or a person or whatever. And so I do believe you, and I want to just really sort of thank you for making this distinction about being 3 to 4 feet away from this thing and it looking at you. So now, was there an emotional reaction when it looked at you?
No, not, I can't really say that there was, because I didn't feel, all of this is filtered through what happened a couple of seconds later, which was it disappearing. And that's kind of when the whole thing took on this element of oh, that was actually a very strange little interaction that I just had. So I can't in good faith say that I felt anything initially, other than being a little taken aback by speaking to this thing and it clearly reacting to me speaking to it.
For sure. Thank you for making that distinction. And I ask that just because at certain junctures in people's fairy encounters, there is that moment which I think you got to when it disappeared. And I'm just always curious when that realization strikes people. And I think you've already quite clearly for the audience delineated that for you it was when it disappeared. I was just curious if maybe you'd gotten a little hint of it when it looked at you. That's why I asked. So it then departs the riverbank. And as you described, it sort of flies up and around you in a semicircle. And as I think I recall, you say that you never really stopped looking at this thing the entire time. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so I would say that the thing that was more striking, so the three things that were odd about it was it disappearing, it reacting to my voice, but the second, I got more of a sense that something was odd, not so much from it reacting to my voice, but when it went to fly away, the position it put its body in. That was something that struck me as immediately as very odd, because it was horizontal to the ground, kind of canted back a little bit so that its head was facing up and we were looking at each other. And then when it went to fly, its body went from relatively horizontal to vertical.
That doesn't make sense because a butterfly can't take off, it would be shooting forward.
Yeah, it was very weird. And like I said, it wasn't like it stood up on its very back legs, but it was like almost like the legs on the left-hand side of its body and the legs on its right-hand side of its body worked in unison to kind of turn its body upward like that.
That is an interesting distinction because I'm not an aeronautical engineer by any stretch of the imagination, but a bug like a butterfly is usually landing and taking off from a horizontal body position because of the dynamics of the wing. Like the wings need clearance, and it's interesting because if we're talking about a magical or otherwise specially capable yet to be clearly defined species, I will say I spoke to another guest yesterday from Argentina, so totally a world removed from your encounter, and he is also describing a flight and stationary position much like you are, which is a remarkable almost up and down type position. In his encounter, there is more of a man silhouette to what he saw, whereas yours is more of a butterfly in representation. However, both things that stand out to me are just the difficulty of understanding the flight capability or the launch capability from that particular position. So there's some similarities even in that to other fairy encounters that I'd like to share that insight with you. I guess I'd just like to ask now about the disappearance, since we've covered most of the other critical details about your encounter. And William, again, for the audience and for myself, I'm just going to extend an extremely big thanks for taking the time to get into this detail.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you again. Yeah, it's super valuable for people listening to hear the perspectives and stories of fairy encounters from a variety of voices. And I'm trying to bring on as much diverse voice because fairy encounters are not exclusive to a particular type of person or a particular area of the earth. They're everywhere, first of all, and anybody can potentially see them or run across them. So because they are a real part of earth, they're a real phenomenon. So if you could please be so gracious as to just finish off with the description of the disappearance in a little bit more detail. I think you said you were looking at it, it went up in the sky to the center point. Basically, it is directly over the river, or the creek, I should say. And as you're looking at it do this in the clear blue sky, it disappears. Is that accurate? Could you build on that, please?
Yeah, so and I do want to stress again that from the time it took off from one side of the bank and flew that semicircle over the field a little bit, it never got more than, let's say, 15 feet away from me. And I turned and watched it as it flew, and I never took eyes off of it. And it was, the best way I can describe it was it hit that center of the creek, and it just wasn't there anymore. There wasn't any sort of light effect, there wasn't any sort of distortion or haziness or puff of smoke. It was there, and then a fraction of a second later, it was just not there anymore. Almost like it had flown behind a barrier.
And this is where you got some goosebumps, I think you said.
Yeah, that was when, I mean, because I could, if it had flown across the creek and into the woods on the other side, I would have probably forgotten about the whole thing 20 minutes later. But the fact that it I watched this thing go from clearly in my vision to nowhere to be seen, and not even like losing sight of it, because yeah, I scanned that area very intensely immediately afterwards. It wasn't like I thought, oh, that was weird, maybe I'll go try and find it again. I was watching it, it was gone, and then I searched for it and it never showed back up.
One thing you said earlier that stands out for me as well is that these butterflies are not known for blending in.
Mm.
William, the person I spoke to from Argentina yesterday, and I find it fascinating that there's some almost story arc it seems to be unfolding, as though, and I'm just speaking in totally, I feel uncomfortable saying these thoughts sometimes as part of the podcast, but I'll go ahead and say this one. It's almost as though the fairies here are serving me up guests that the last one confirms the next one, and so Maddie from Argentina, who I spoke with, describes watching the fairy, never leaving his vision at all. His total encounter is about 12 seconds, and as he's watching this fairy, he has his cell phone in his pocket. He's locked onto the fairy because it's so fascinating to him. He grabs his cell phone, he pulls it out, he's watching the fairy. He doesn't even look at his phone. He just got it in his hand out of his pocket at this point, watching. And he wants to take a picture of it in his mind. And he's watching it, and as he describes, the forest floor in Argentina is like barren because the canopy is really high. So the forest floor is just like dirt mostly. And he says there's a single flower on the forest floor. And he watched the thing move towards the flower, and as he described it, it just disappeared into the flower, or just disappeared. Like, he was basically describing what you're describing, which is that he was looking at it full on, full time, watching everything it was doing because it was fascinating to him, locked onto it visually, and watched it simply disappear. And as he put it, I didn't see anything special. It just wasn't there anymore. And that's so similar to what you've just described. So for that reason, I wanted to share that with you. And hopefully when we're done talking, I'll give you that episode to listen to and you can hear it for yourself.
Yeah, that would be great.
It hasn't been published yet, but I'll give you a sneak peek as a thank you for doing this call with me today. I do know, William, that you have to go and get on with some other responsibilities for your day. So let me thank you again very much for being here. I'll just ask you one final question that I like to ask all of my guests who come on the show. There's no wrong answer here. Nobody has a fairy in a jar on their kitchen counter that they're studying. And there's really not very good contemporary information on fairies outside of folklore, etc. And so there is no wrong answer here, and nobody knows what is the right answer. So with that said, what I would like to ask you is, what do you think fairies are? What do you think what you saw is? Basically, my question is just that, is what do you think fairies are, William?
You know, I don't have a good idea of what I think they are, per se. Like, is this a living, breathing thing? Is this a natural phenomena? Is this something that is strictly in the realm of the paranormal? But something that has helped me rationalize not just this experience, but talking to people about ghosts, for example. For the majority of human history, one of the only things that's been constant as our scientific understanding of the world has advanced is that there's so much more going on around us than we previously even thought was possible. It wasn't very long ago that our entire understanding of the medical system was uprooted by the discovery of germs. And germs are an undeniable aspect of daily life. They're all over us, they're inside of us, they're on every surface that we touch. And we don't see them, but that doesn't mean that they don't have immediate and very tangible and observable impacts on ourselves and on the world that we live in. Another side of that being, I'm just completely fascinated with prehistory. And just because you don't see Tyrannosaurus Rex walking around today doesn't mean that if you look in the right place, you can't find the evidence that these things are a part of the history of our planet. And you can take that out beyond planet Earth as well. It wasn't very long ago that the concept of the vastness of the universe was something that was completely foreign to the leading scientific minds at the time. So as far as what fairies are, I have no idea. I couldn't even begin to really formulate a hypothesis on that. But I think the mechanism for which they exist and interact with us is not really that strange of a concept. We know that we are completely surrounded by, for lack of a better term, an invisible world when it comes to germs. We're surrounded by an invisible world when it comes to space. We're surrounded by an invisible world when it comes to the biodiversity of the ocean. And even in our backyards, we've got something that lives under our shit. Some sort of burrowing mammal. No idea what it is, but we see the evidence for it. And I think that the amount of not even just personal experiences that people are sharing with you, but that so many cultures from all over the world have this story that they're sharing collectively. I think that makes the concept of fairies very tangible.
William, thank you for putting that way. I'm going to be so bold as to make a statement here. First of all, the act of trying to build this podcast has been difficult because there's so much lack of credibility assigned immediately when you say the word fairy. So I'll complete my thought here quite quickly, but basically when I put a post up saying, hey, have you seen a fairy? Please reach out to me. The vast majority of people read that post and immediately bring to that reading their preconceived notion of what the word fairy is. And that can range from fairy tale stories to Tinkerbell. And so when someone says, F no, fairies aren't real. They're thinking about what they think a fairy is when they say that. They're not thinking about an experience like the one that you've had, which, do you know that that's a fairy 100%? No, you don't, and neither do I. But when you're trying to fit what you have experienced into a context of something approaching understanding, fairy logically matches some of the touch points of what you experienced, but not others. And this is where the gap is currently in the understanding of how to understand what a fairy is. And so what I want to say that's bold is that I feel that this episode in particular will be a benchmark episode for this podcast. And the reason I feel that is because you in particular have offered such a sober, recalcitrant, straightforward account of what has happened here. You are not a paranormal researcher. You're not releasing a book. You're a firefighter. And it's clear in your discussion and the words you choose and the way that you're choosing to frame things with your sentences that you are trying to describe this in a way that can be accepted as a factual experience and not in a way that you are going to allow for it to be dismissed from the ways that people can dismiss things like I just started talking about at the start of this thought, right? You saw something real and you're struggling to understand that, but at the same time, you make an extremely good point, which is that it is not that hard to conceive of a realm or a dimension or a component of Earth's natural structure that allows for this phenomena. That is where a rational person would start to look for a explanation for the aspects of the phenomena they experienced, especially the disappearance. You know, what I can offer you as an insight, and I don't know this is true, and I'm not the authority, but many people I speak to that have looked into this and have also seen fairies suggest that fairies are pure energy in some way of being able to understand that. They're a pure energy being. So taxonomically, you could classify them as an energy being, of which I think there are other types of energy beings potentially. But we won't even go there today. We're just talking about fairies here on this show. Anyway, my point being is that you have done a very good service to this topic. And I would even go so far as to say you've done a good service to this debate by offering your sober, pragmatic, non-embellished, very factual retelling of what you have experienced. And so for that reason, I want to deeply thank you because not that my other guests are not also telling the truth, and not that my other guests are not also very credible, but just the way you've approached this is something that will lend this podcast future success because it will encourage other people that are on the fence about talking to someone like me or talking at all about their fairy encounter. It will lend them a lot of comfort, and you will embolden and provide them with courage by the demonstration of your own bravery and courage to talk about this in a plain fashion with me. And so that's really all I have to say about your answer as to what fairies are. Is I appreciate the honest skepticism, and I do think you've done a very big service to both me, the listeners, and everybody else who's seen fairies and needs that to be validated, understood, and taken seriously. So thank you very much for that. William, as I move to let you go here, I would just like to ask you in an open way if you have any final thoughts, comments, anything you'd like to say to the audience at all before I let you go here tonight.
Yeah, I don't want to get too into the weeds on it because that is my story from the Forest Service. I've never, seen a Bigfoot or had an encounter with the little people. But I do want to say, and I think that there's a chunk of people in the wildfire community who will probably be able to relate to this. There is a lot of stories in that community of people who have had really intense and interesting encounters while spending long periods of time out in the wilderness. And I've heard some stories from people who I absolutely trust with my life. And I think if enough people got together to share their experiences, it wouldn't have to be a scary thing to do. I mean, because even in this recounting, you know, I would never tell you the forest that this happened on or the name of the crew that I was working with because well, A, I was the only witness, but B, when I've had these conversations in the field with people out on fires, like, hey, have you ever seen anything weird? You know, that kind of talk comes up pretty frequently. And it's usually prefaced with, I don't want to hear you sharing this with people. So I won't share any of those stories. But I think the Forest Service community is a massive, untapped wealth of knowledge on these subjects because these people are out in the woods for long periods of time and they're not doing so recreationally. They're there to do a job. And if it's the same as like if you're working in an office building and you see something strange, you might not, you're there to work. You're not there necessarily daydreaming or, you know, goofing around. And so I would really strongly encourage anyone who has a story that they may be nervous or embarrassed or hesitant to share, especially from that community, to do so in a way like this podcast, where it can be as anonymous as you make it. You're not shouting it out for everyone to hear. But if someone tunes into your show who was also on a fire crew and hears someone share their experience, I just hope that that person would also come forward and say, hey, it doesn't even have to be an experience with, you know, what we would call a fairy. It could be like, hey, I saw a UFO. I saw something I can't explain, but I am a professional. I know what animals are. I know the basic fundamentals of reality, and I'm not crazy, so just hear me out.
William, you're a very profound and effective communicator. I would like to acknowledge that. And I would also like to say this again, which is I think it is very brave of you to speak with me. And I say that to most of my guests. And in this moment in particular, I want everyone listening to really understand I mean that, because I'll even give myself a pat on the back and self-acknowledge it's brave of me to talk about it, because I catch so much shit. And, you know, What you've just said is extremely meaningful, if to no one else, to me. And so I really appreciate what you have just said there. And with that really beautiful thought of inviting other stories, I would like to remind the audience listening that if you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, just shoot me an email at encounters@fascinatingfae.com. You can also shoot me a message on Messenger, Instagram. Just get a hold of me. Really, any channel works for me. William, I would like to thank you very much on behalf of all of our human and non-human listeners for coming on the Fascinating Fae podcast tonight and sharing your experience with us. Big thanks to William from everybody out there listening tonight. Thank you, William, for being here. I really appreciate it, sir.
Oh, you're very welcome. I appreciate the opportunity to share this, and I will say I was a little nervous to do so because I didn't know what angle you were going to be coming at this from necessarily, and I feel like one of the big misconceptions is that when people think about encounters like this, they immediately want to jump to like, oh, well, what kind of crystal did you have in your pocket, and what phase was the moon in, and what kind of runes were you dreaming about? And not to say that I look down on that stuff, but that's just not how I approach things. And so I'm glad that that wasn't something that you were asking me too much about, because I just would not have been able to answer questions about my experience from a more mystical perspective of it.
I'm 44. I saw a fairy, and I also just line up right with what you're saying. I'm not a folklorist. I'm not a paranormal researcher. I'm a normal, well, I used to run cannabis dispensaries, so to what extent that makes me abnormal, I don't really know. But I did that because I was in a serious motorcycle accident, and I believe in cannabis as an alternative to opioids, which are killing people. And I'll just leave that there. But I'm a normal person. I've dealt with governments, doctors, civic authorities, bylaw enforcement, the CRA, which is our Canadian Tax Authority. You know, I've got lots and lots of experience doing incredible things just like you. And I'm not coming to this from a perspective of the justification being magic. I will leave you with this thought, since we do need to let you go out of respect for your time and the audience's time today. But maybe, right, magic is it predates a particular set of scientific understandings, and the magic justification for fairies was a very good way of understanding what people were experiencing back then. Moving forward, we shouldn't throw out the insights from that knowledge base and that language talking about this phenomena, but I'm here trying to put a contemporary focus on these encounters as something still going on today, and through the lens of all the understanding that guests have about the world in 2024, looking at it like from that perspective. And you have added so much value to that effort that I have initiated. And so, you know, I want to take you out for a beer on a side note and just say thank you for helping me feel validated through the approach to this conversation. And so with that thought, one more time, on behalf of all of our human and non-human listeners tuning in tonight, especially the large butterfly that you saw in Montana, who's definitely listening in. Big thanks to William for coming on the Fascinating Fae podcast. William, thank you again for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This was more fun than I was expecting it to be. So.
Thinking of the weight of the world, and I'm carrying the largest load, waiting to arrive at whatever there lies at the end of the road. If anybody's listening, there was need, it's time to tumble all the walls. Is there anybody out there anyway? Is there anybody out there anyway? Thinking of the nature of man, and is there a master plan? 100 million dead by another man's hand, and still the bombs aren't banned. And you can feel the thunder of the babies when they grow. And you can see their halos when they walk into the room. Is there anybody out there anyway? Is there anybody out there anyway? Well, I don't see how there can actually be, or else they would try to intervene. Is anybody out there anyway? Is there anybody out there anyway? Is there anybody out there anyway? Is there anybody out there anyway? Well, I don't see how there can actually be, or else they would try to intervene.